Hey, what's up everybody, Az here for Tomo USA. Today I'm going to be showing you how to set up your actuator on the all-new MX series Tomo Arms Turbo. Now, one of the key features about this new actuator is that you can swap out the springs to set your desired boost. So let's head over to the bench and we'll show you how it's done. So let's first start by removing the actuator from the turbocharger. Next, we're going to remove the rod, and then the bracket, and then the swivel nipple. Next, I'm going to show you how to disassemble the actuator housing. And to do that, we're using a vise and two sockets. Although you can use a similar tool or device to achieve the same result. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because we want to relieve the tension that the spring inside is putting on the lock ring. So to do that, we're just going to apply just enough pressure with the vise so that it holds the actuator firmly in place. And then that's going to allow us to unscrew the lock ring by hand. Okay, there we go. Right. Now, before we remove this, what you're going to want to do is to just make a small mark on both the top, or rather the bottom and the top housing. Now, this is just so that you've got a point of reference for when you're putting the whole assembly back together, so that everything is in exactly the same position as it was when you first started. Now, we're going to slowly relieve the pressure, and you're going to notice that the spring is going to push the components outwards, so be very, very careful. Okay. And then we're just going to slowly remove from the vise. There we go. Once that's done, we can remove the casing and then disassemble the internal components, like so. Okay, next I'm going to show you how to change the actuator springs. Now, to do that, we're first going to remove this nut here using a spanner. And then just before we take it off, we're just going to apply a little bit of pressure to the spring, which relieves the stress on the nut and the guide. Just lets us take that off much easier. And then we're going to take off the lower seat, remove the spring. Now, in this example, we're going to be using 3 springs, and you're going to notice that there's seats for each spring. So we'll start with the innermost spring. And we're just going to make sure that that's correctly seated in position. Next, we're going to take the middle spring. That's going to sit on one step outside of the innermost spring. And then we've got the outermost spring, which sits just on the outside, sits like so. Then we're going to put the retaining cap back on. And then again, we're just going to apply a little bit of pressure so that we can get the guide and the nut back on. Like so. And then we're just going to give it a few turns with the spanner so that it's secure. Now, once you've got that done, it's time to put it back into the actuator casing. Now, just make sure that, again, you make a note of the white marks that we left earlier for the correct alignment. So we're going to put the springs back in, put the diaphragm on top, and then the upper casing, notice the white mark. Just going to make sure that that lines up so that it goes back in exactly the same position as when we first started. And then we're just going to loosely cover with a lock ring. And then after this, we're going to put it back onto the vise, and I'll show you how to tighten everything down. So to tighten down the actuator casing, we're just going to be using the same method as we used earlier to disassemble the actuator casing. So we're going to just lightly place in the vise and just apply slight pressure, just enough to hold the actuator in place. So then we're just going to make sure that we've got everything aligned correctly, just making sure that the alignment marks as well, that they're in the correct position. And then we're just going to slowly, oops, it's a little bit high. Just going to slowly tighten like so. Then once you've confirmed that the marks are exactly where they were to start with, we're going to place the lock ring. And then just make sure that you tighten it down as much as you can by hand, like so. Then once that's done, then just remove from the vise. Again, just be very careful and do this very slowly just to be on the safe side. And there we go, that's the actuator housing reassembled. Okay, so now that we've reassembled our actuator, you're going to want to mount it back onto the turbocharger like we've already done so here. Now to do that, just follow the same steps for disassembly but in reverse order. Next, we need to connect the rod to the arm that operates the valve. Now to do that, first just make sure the lock nut for the clevis is loose, and then you just need to turn the clevis clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on how far out or how far in it needs to be in relation to the arm. Now to get the correct positioning, all you do is close the valve completely, and that'll bring the arm around like so. Then with the valve completely closed, the clevis should be able to just about latch onto the arm just like that. Now once you're happy with the positioning, just tighten down the lock nut, just gently for now. Then after this, we'll show you how to apply the preload. Okay, so before we go ahead and apply the preload, we first need to dismount the rod temporarily from the arm. Okay. And then what we need to do is we need to adjust the length of the rod to accommodate for the preload. Now the preload on these actuators is 2 millimeters. So what we're going to do is, with a pair of digital calipers, we're just going to measure the distance on the rod here. Now there are lots of ways in which you can do this. This is just one way. Okay. Now that we've got that measurement, we need to adjust the length of this rod by 2 millimeters. So it needs to be 2 millimeters shorter to accommodate the preload. So we're just going to loosen the lock nut. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to turn the clevis like we did earlier to get our desired length. Okay. Right, so let's just make sure that that's 2 millimeters shorter. Okay, so that's about right. Now it doesn't have to be exactly right, but it does need to be as close to 2 millimeters as possible. Okay. Now with the valve closed again, you're going to notice that it doesn't quite reach the arm. Now that's absolutely fine, and I'll show you why in a moment. But first, let's just get our lock nut back into place for now so that our clevis doesn't move. Okay, so now we're just going to put the rod over the arm so that it's not connecting. And then you're going to see that it needs to move outwards in order to join. Now to do that, we're connecting our actuator up to our compressed air system. You are going to need some kind of air system, whether it be like a casual air gun like so, or a full-on air compressor system. It's entirely up to you. Okay, so now we're just going to slowly apply some air pressure. And what this is going to do is it's going to push the rod. Again, just make sure that you've got the rod aligned correctly onto the clevis arm. Then it's going to snap into place like so. Right. Now once you've got that there, you can then relieve the air. Okay. And then just make sure that your lock nut is nice and tight. And then last but not least, let's take the locking pin for the arm and the clevis. And then again, just be careful when you're doing this. There we go. And that's everything set. So there you have it, that's how you set up the Tomei Turbo Actuator. Now the rod designs may vary slightly depending on which engine or which platform you choose to buy for, but fundamentally the same setup processes apply. So for full details, visit tomeigusa.com and we'll see you guys in the next one.